Hey, what's up, folks? I want to tell you this episode is going to have conversation about suicide, about bullying, and hopefully it's going to provide some tips and tools for you as a teacher, as an educator, potentially as parents, because we know that some of the things that needs to happen are difficult. They're hard to talk about, and sometimes they're even hard to execute. So please enjoy today's episode. Thank you for listening. Oh, and just by the way, I'm going to be reading some notes because there's so much that I don't want to miss some things, but also I just want you to know that like I really thought about this a lot, and there's some most of stuff going to come from my soul, but I wanted to make sure I hit some targets and definitely some data that I want to make sure I get carefully and correctly. Okay, so just prepare yourself for I'm going to be doing some a little bit of reading. Hopefully, it won't sound like I'm reading. Here we go. In this episode, you're going to learn what happened at Santa Clara High School and a key statistic about bullying, some specific things you can do as a teacher to address bullying. You're going to learn and hear about statistics about suicide rates that are particularly alarming for young men and men alike, and some personal stories about my journey around suicide and as an educator, how I've been able to try and do the best I can to support students. So we're going to jump in to the conversation, talking with male educators. As a male educator at your school site, it can get lonely. Only 23% of K-12 educators in America are male. And just think about what this gender gap means for your male students. They experience disproportionate levels of discipline. This is a show for male educators who want to feel more understood by their community and want to create emotionally safe classrooms and schools for the next generation of male students. Welcome to Unmasking with Male Educators. On November 12, 2024, 14-year-old Jose Zamora took his own life after being bullied for weeks because he was living at a homeless shelter and being raised by a single father. His mother was not around. Some students had found out where he lived after he was walking home from school, and they began to bring that information back to school and use it against him. Jose Zamora had only been in high school for 3 months. He was a freshman. The community was outraged that the district wasn't properly addressing the culture of bullying. Parents, even Santa Clara High School alumni, came to the board meeting to describe their own stories of bullying that they had endured while they were in school. Cabrillo Middle School teacher Joan Maurer had Zamora as a student and gave a heartfelt, tearful account of his resiliency at Cabrillo. Maurer acknowledged the bullying issue and also asked the district to examine the high school's transitioning system to support students during this especially stressful time. One of the questions she said is, how can we ensure an equitable transition to show students are supported in a way they need and deserve to be? This is what Miss Joan Maurer said at the board meeting. So, as you hear, this student who was going through some really tough times. Not only was his father trying to get them into a house, they were staying in this shelter in between time. There was a lot of stress that was going on with the family, and this young man was figuring it out by himself. From some of the interviews with the dad didn't mention that he knew about it, but as a young man, I can imagine him not wanting to stress his dad even more with his stuff. And how often do we do that? How often do we protect other people's feelings because we don't want to worry them more? And how often are our kids doing that for us as parents? How are they doing that for us as teachers? They're like, well, I don't want to bother them, and I don't want nobody to know. I don't want to get more in trouble. I don't want to be all the ways that it happens. So listen, my heart, when I first heard about this story, I heard about it a week before it showed up in the newspaper. Well, not newspaper, in the news. There's a family in San Jose. His cousin shared it with somebody in San Jose, and they shared it on social media. So I learned about it, and I'm like, where are the articles? Why are there no articles about this? And then finally, the articles began to come out. My heart was broken about what I heard. And every time I hear about a young person who takes their lives, whose lives end too soon, it is the reason why I do this work. It is the reason why the Million Mask movement was started. It was the reason why the Ever Forward Club was started. And I'm asking you right now, as you think about maybe just taking a moment of silence for that young man, Jose. If it's something that you can't fathom because you never would think of something like that, that's good. That's good. But when others are struggling and suffering, our answer should be, man, I hear you, I see you. As opposed to, hey, sorry, must be bad to be you. That doesn't help. It doesn't help our young people grow and develop. It doesn't help them navigate the tough times. We need to build communities where we show kindness and love and empathy. Now, I shared the story of Jose as a catalyst to the conversation we're going to talk about today around not only the topic of suicide, but the topic of bullying. And sometimes even when I say the word suicide, I feel like I'm saying a bad word. Like I don't want to say it, but we got to talk about it. We got to talk about it. We have to know that our young people are struggling in silence. And we as adults, we as teachers, we as administrators, we as parents, coaches, community members, we have to be the voice for them while they find their own voice. This conversation is not an easy one. I'm going to share some statistics and some data that I think will be helpful for us to be mindful of. And then I'm going to talk about some stories. And I'm hoping that it will feel like an opportunity for us to grow together and learn. Our young people are asking us to pay attention. The Million Mask Movement, you can go to the website and make a mask. You can see what's happening with young people around the country, around the world, who are stressed, who are worried, who are afraid, who don't talk about it. They name it as things on the back of the mask: stress, worry, fear, doubt, anxiety. They don't talk about it. And what we know is that there's only so much they can take. There's only so much that you can take. So as I jump into this data, I don't want to ignore the fact that we're talking about a human life here. This conversation today has been plaguing my heart. I don't know how much you know about the journey about Ever Forward, about myself. I didn't always plan to be a teacher, but when teaching called me, I was clear this is the work I'm supposed to do. And I've lost several students, and I even lost one to suicide. And I want you to know that phone call was one of the most stunning phone calls I would never forget. When I was told by one of our alumni about what had happened, I'm like, what do you mean? I just talked to him 2 weeks ago. And that day I'll never forget. And I was kind of standing in this hallway at this event. I was actually at a screening for the documentary, The Mask You Live In. And I was I'd seen the documentary already, 15, 20 times at that time. So I didn't necessarily need to be in there watching it, but I had guests there. So they were wondering where I was at. And after I get this phone call, I'm just kind of in the hallway, just what do I do? I don't even know where to, how do I have time I don't have time to process this, but I'm what do I do with all this energy now that's flowing through my body, this grief, this sadness? And I want you to know that I don't wish that on anybody. I don't wish that on anybody. And I want you to know that as I learned about this young man, Jose Zamora, and then I learned about this 30 plus year old who also experienced the same thing, I know that it is not about their age. It is about the ability to know that there are people who got me. And even when you have people who got you, who care about you, who love you, it sometimes can not feel that way. And so as I continue to process my own grief of a story of a young man who I knew very well, and as I learn more about what's happening in our schools and our communities over and over, I'm inviting you to help us be a part of the solution. We could be a part of the solution together. And so when I jump into the numbers, don't let the numbers make you think I'm just trying to make him one of the numbers, but I want you to see some of the numbers to understand the bigger impact of this work, okay? 46% of bullied students report notifying an adult about the incident, which means that 54% of the students do not. Now, this is important as we talk about not only why the reporting doesn't happen and what do we do when the reporting does happen. So let me give you some more statistics about suicide, and then we'll jump into some really direct information about what I've seen in as educator and what we can do as community to really better serve students. Okay. So in 2022, this is the last data that was available by the CDC. Men die by suicide 3.85 times more than women. Males make up 50% of the population, but nearly 80% of the suicides. Suicide rates increased 37% between 2000 and 2018. There was a small decrease between 2018 and 2020, and then the rates have returned to their peak in 2022. Now, we know that there's a lot of things that we're still learning about what took place during the pandemic in terms of the social isolation of students in their schools, in their communities, in their families, around where they live. And we know that some of the behavior that we continue to see coming back to school that is being described by teachers as being very aggressive, as being hurtful, harmful. Now, listen, as a former educator, as a former administrator, as a former student who was bullied, and as a student who then saw the bullying stop and felt how school experienced that way, I can speak from different lenses around this topic. Now, if you were never bullied, if you never had a bullying situation in your life, it may be easy to just dismiss the people who have experienced it. But I think that as educators and as teachers and as administrators and as parents, we have a role to play, because sometimes if we have not experienced it, we can dismiss what other people are feeling. We can dismiss what students are feeling when they come to us. Now, as a teacher, when I was in a classroom, I not only saw what was actually happening in front of me, I was paying attention to the undercurrent of what was happening in my classroom. I made a story once about how in my English class, Miss BP's class, I talk about Miss BP a lot. My friends, that's what I called them, and they were in many cases my friends. They used to put tacks in my chairs. Now they don't even think they make tacks anymore, but there are these little pins that are flat on the bottom, like kind of curvature, and they sit on it. They put on the chair, and since you're on the chair in most old school chairs, there are these wood rivets that have these little silver rivets. They would just blend them into one of the rivets, or they would just put it and you don't pay attention. But I would sit on a tack, and then I would yell, like, because it hurt, first of all. And second of all, like, it was like, what the heck? And then the teacher's mad at me because I'm yelling out. And I'm like, it wasn't even my fault. But what happens in those moments, now I didn't call it being bullied by those guys because it was more of a joke. And sometimes I can be honest that I probably did it to them. But the bullying that did happen to me was happening in the PE area, in the locker room. My lunch money was getting taken. Now, I told no one. I definitely didn't tell my friends, because there is stigma, and there was back then, and there is still today, which is why we see 54% of students who are experiencing it don't tell anyone, because you feel the way you're going to be looked at by society. You maybe fear what the principals are going to say with them. You're going to have to go tell on somebody, and then you're going to be a snitch, and then all the layers that come into that kind of language. You may be afraid to tell your family because they're expecting you to be tough and strong and never let anybody take advantage of you. And then you're like, well, but I'm afraid. And so whatever the reasons are that people don't tell people, I'm clear that I just knew that my mom had too many other problems to worry about. I'm the oldest. I'm responsible for my siblings. I ain't got time to have my mom tripping about me. And I definitely can't have her come up to the school acting out. So I kept it to myself. I kept it to myself. And it wasn't until just a series of events where finally I had to get some help. Now, I've told that story before, so I'm not going to go into my deeper story about my own bullying, but I am going to talk about what I experienced as an educator, what I experienced as an administrator. Because if we don't navigate how we are experiencing education as the adults, now I see education through a lens of all kinds of things. And you got to think about yourself. How do you see education? What are the lenses that you wear of how you see education? Do you see education as a former good student? Do you see education as a former student who hated school? Maybe you're a kid who battled with reading, or you had challenges in academic mathematics. How do you see education? hopefully you see it from an empathetic lens, even if it wasn't your personal story, but sometimes it's hard to do. What I have seen when bullying situations come to teachers and sometimes to administrators is that if they have not experienced it, it can be easy to wonder if this kid is just taking it too serious. If this kid is misinterpreting playing for some kind of bullying. If this kid is just too sensitive. And so anything about being left out feels like being picked on. Now, as a teacher, when I look at my classroom and I'm aware of all the things that are happening, there are things that are happening all the time. There are the conversation that's happening out loud, and then there's the undercurrent of what's happening under the table, what's happening with people's materials on the table. Are people grabbing their stuff and not asking permission? Are people taking their pencil or taking their paper? Or are people grabbing somebody's paper from across the room because they know that they can get away with it? Like, what are all the behaviors that show up that we often may not notice if we're not paying attention to the undercurrent of what's happening? It's hard enough to pay attention to everything that's really happening, but the undercurrents are different. Now, if you wanted to support a student who may not be going through something difficult, but you noticed something that was a little off, it could be helpful is to pull that student aside and say, "Hey, I just want to let you know, I saw somebody grab your paper earlier and you didn't say anything. So I just want to make sure that everything's okay." Like, I'm not going to necessarily go to this other kid and say, "Hey, why are you taking that kid's paper?" Because then that means I'm putting a light on that kid as being somebody who didn't stop somebody else from taking their paper. There's all the social dynamics you have to be careful about too. And as a person who was bullied, I'm trying never to put a light on somebody that will make them feel more vulnerable or more in a spotlight. And so my goal is always to start with the baby steps. Well, let me just ask the kid, did they feel what I noticed? Because maybe I'm just feeling it for them and it's not real for them. And if they say, "Oh no, it was no big deal. I told him that he could borrow it." Okay, great. Well, I want you to know, if ever there's a situation where, that's not the case, please be sure and you let me know. Because what I want the student to know is that I'm paying attention to stuff that people are not usually paying attention to, that I am here for you, even if you feel that you don't want to tell me about it. But I think we have to keep the door open. And I think educators have a huge role to play because you are the front lines of defense to schools and students and behavior. Now, here's the next level of how this challenge shows up. And it shows up sometimes not only in the classroom, it shows up outside on the playground. I'm not expecting anybody to see everything because I never saw everything. I don't think it's possible to see everything. But I think it's important that students know they can come to you when they're experiencing something that is causing them distress. And the worst thing they could do is to have somebody come to you when they're under distress and have you tell them, "Get over it. Don't worry about it." Now, if you are an educator who cares about students learning, it's really important that you know that it is almost impossible to learn when you're sitting in a seat in a classroom where you're feeling fear. Fear has a way of gripping you, holding you, grabbing your mind and making up all the scenarios. And so it's so important that students know when they come and bring something to you that somebody's going to listen to them. Now, if I'm bringing a story to if somebody brings me a story about something that's going on with them, I have two options. I can listen to it, and then I can figure out, well, what do I need to do about this story? There was a situation where there's so many stories I can think of, but there's one in particular where a student came to the office. The student was feeling really stressed out. Something happened in the PE area. They were drinking water, and some guy pushed their head down. And listen, there's some games that you find that young men play that other people don't play. They don't push your head down toward their crotch or something like that. They don't do kind of behavior like that. Now, this student was like, "I was just drinking water, and then he grabbed my head and blah, blah, blah." And the student was like, I was like, "Okay, tell me something." We have as a administrator, my job is to take a report to figure out what happened. Was there anybody else there? Did anybody else see it? What else happened? And sometimes in those moments, you have a responsibility to just be like, "Okay, I'm trying to let me visualize it, what you're saying happened, so I can make sure that when I talk to the other student, that I can get more data. And I think that sometimes in those moments when you're having a conversation with a student and you're trying to feel like you may feel like you're interrogating them, but sometimes it's not really. It's like I'm trying to understand like what actually played out so that I can then do something. But I can't just go punish somebody because of the words. I need to then understand the story. And a lot of that work is the work of educators, asking good questions, giving students room to navigate how this thing happened, how this emotional overload has happened to them. I ultimately believe that we as educators have a huge role to play today more than ever. The level of meanness. Now, people don't usually use that word when they talk about he's being really mean. What does that mean? What does that mean he's being mean? Well, he's talking to me disrespectfully. He's making fun of me. He's calling me names. He's pushing me. He's grabbing my stuff. Like there's lots of layers of behavior. Now, this episode wasn't really meant to be all about bullying, because what we really talked about at the beginning was what happens when the bullying hits a level of overstress, distress, where students begin harming themselves. Now, sadly, what we talked about, what happened with Jose Zamora, was tragic. And there's more stories, not only here in the Bay Area, of young people whose lives have ended way too early. And we as educators today more than ever, and knowing that what's happening with the stress of families that students bring with them, and then that stress shows up as well in the classrooms, in the playgrounds, and all these areas, we have an opportunity more than ever to really begin paying attention. Paying attention to what we see, paying attention to what we hear, what we think we hear, and maybe before we accuse a student of something, we can just begin asking questions, being curious. Hey, why did you say that? Why did you say that to them? Why did you say that to that person? Why are you talking to her like that? Because if our radars are going off, then we're adults. Sometimes we hear words that don't sound like we want to be hearing, but kids are like, oh, that's no big deal. That just means this, because language changes and transitions over the years. But more than ever, what I'm inviting you today is to be thinking about these things. I want to give you a couple of questions that you can think about in your school, with your teachers, with your administrators. What do the statistics that you heard about suicide say about the needs of your male students? The fact that young men and men are harming themselves at rates so large, what does that say about the students that you see every day? That's a question that I'm inviting you to ask yourself. For me, when I'm thinking about that question, I know that our young men need a space to talk about how they feel. Because what we see over and over again, young men and men not talking about how they feel, the pressure, the worry, the stress overloads them. And then boom, the explosion happens like a landmine. No one saw it coming. No one knew they were going through that. No one knew that they were stressed out. No one knew they were worried. And over again, we continue to hear about these behaviors. Now, what happened at that school in Santa Clara is a little different, because other people were around. Other people were around. And maybe even in those situations, no one was an upstander, as they used to call it. I don't know what word they use for it today. No one said, "Let me go tell somebody. I'm not going to be I'm not going to be called a snitch. I'm not going to let anybody know that. But I'm going to go say something because this kid is getting picked on and no one's saying anything." Silence does not mean that I'm okay with you picking on me. Silence can mean lots of things. It can mean I'm afraid. It could be fear. It could be worry. It could be like, it's not, I don't even notice it. Those are opportunities for us as educators to be mindful of the behaviors that are happening that we can't always see. The trust. How much trust are we building in students that they come to us and tell us stuff that they know that we're not going to hopefully make their lives worse because they've stepped up and was responsible for helping someone else? It's so important. Now, for those who are teachers, I talked a lot about some of the administrative stuff, but let me go back to teaching real quick. In the classroom, the opportunity to be aware of behaviors that we don't understand, that we may just have a curiosity about, is opportunities for us to bring students aside to say, hey, the mask work that we talk about is connected to this work. It's not all the things that students are saying and doing out loud. It's the things that are happening underneath. Most bullies are not out just starting fights. They're not really wanting to fight. They're looking for opportunities to have power over someone else. The power over someone else isn't like, hey, put up your dukes, let's fight. The power over you is, I'm going to do it and you're not going to say anything. And I'm going to find the people who are going to let me have power over them, and I can feel their discomfort about the power. They're letting me do this, or they're not stopping me, so therefore I'm going to continue, and that behavior will continue. That is how the bullying turns into the longer term effects. But when it is called out, most times they're like, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. Now, as an administrator, teacher, both, like some of the behaviors that I saw, that before I went and talked to the student and said, hey, did I see this? I would just navigate it myself, because there are certain things that I did see, that I did witness, that I was willing to be wrong about. Hey, why did you go take that person's pencil? Go give it back. Oh, I was just playing. I didn't ask you about that. Go give it back. Now, it could have been playing. It could have been the person said they could come snatch their pencil out of their hand. And it could have been that I just took it too serious and made a big deal about it. But sometimes I just had to follow my own intuition. I didn't always get it right. I sometimes got it wrong. But I knew that my students knew that I was looking out for them, that I was paying attention, that I was not oblivious to the things that were happening in the room. Now, I didn't see everything. There were things that happened I didn't see. I'm like, what happened? And then somebody would tell me, and I'm like, what? And since I didn't see it, now I have to like, let me talk to you both outside, because then I have to like trying to figure things out. I mean, sometimes as a teacher, you're an administrator of your own room. And so you are an administrator. You are the person who's setting the rules and holding people accountable to the behaviors. But it's also important that we are the kind of people who students know they can talk to, they can trust. That's so critical. If we are going to create equitable classrooms where students feel seen, heard, like they belong, they have to also feel like they're safe to get help when it's not working out like that. Now, as an administrator, I've had many phone calls where parents come to me and says, my daughter is being bullied, and I have a responsibility to follow up. Now, some school districts have a process, and I encourage you to find out what your school system's process is. In Oakland, there was a form that must be filled out. It's an investigation form that is, I, as the administrator, have looked into this situation. Here's who I talked to. Here are the things. Now, obviously, with other students' names involved, you can't always give that report to the parent at hand, but you follow with the parent and say, here's what I learned during my investigation. Here's what I learned. Now, sometimes it has been said that when a kid gets left out, and the friends are now transitioning, they go from elementary school to middle school, the friend groups change. Those feelings that students feel when they feel left out is big. And sometimes they may call it bullying. And I think bullying has sometimes gotten combined into other language, like, oh, you were left out, but were you bullied? So important for these conversations to have deeper conversations about these topics. The only way we're going to have these more conversations is if we continue having them. The only way we're going to have students who come to us and tell us, parents, I encourage you, make room for your students to talk about what they feel. Because if we don't give them room to talk about what they feel, we end up feeling what they didn't talk about. We end up feeling what happens when the overload of the pressure, because they had no one that they could think they can trust. A lot of the things that are happening out here in not only the social media world, but the world in general, is a new world. Me as a child, I didn't have there was no cell phone. So you didn't have to worry about people calling you names or telling you things and using your information against you. Like, that didn't happen. So people did it verbally. So anything you got from somebody, you got it verbally or secondhand from that person who told you about that person or that person. Like, it's a phone loop of what people say about you. But now our students are at their dinner table or with their friends, and now somebody's saying something mean about them, and they're like, whoa, and all this pressure and all this worry and all these things are coming at our young people. And we have to protect our young people. As you know, there's plenty of um, movements out there to encourage parents not to give their children phones before they've hit puberty, before their brain has had enough time to develop to be my own unique individual self, be my own amazing, beautiful self, and not be so worried about what other people are saying about me, not being always in the spotlight where people are judging me. This is part of the work. And we as educators get a chance to be a part of that. So listen, our young men are asking us, they're telling us that they want us to see them. And we have opportunity to pay attention to it. As male educators, I thank you for the work you're doing. I thank you for the perspective that you see in the classroom, out on the playground, that you see on the yard, that you see in the gym, that you pay attention to. And whether you've experienced bullying or not before, I ask you, what are some things that you're noticing? What are some things that you're seeing? I know that if you've never experienced it, it's sometimes maybe hard to point it out. But I encourage you as a team, as a staff, to do some days where you do some observations out in the yard together. Maybe that's an idea that your school can try. And I'm not here to give you a bunch of solutions. I mean, I think there's lots of things to try. But guess what? Solving the problem of bullying, it takes a lot of work. And I don't know if it's always something that you can just say, hey, here's the formula to solve it. Because we're talking about people's behavior. And as we know, in the world we live in, people's behavior takes on a world of its own. The kindness, the caring, the empathy, the compassion. It requires a lot of work on our behalf. And so that's what today was about. Today, this conversation, this episode was about building a deeper understanding of not only what you may not see that's happening in schools, teachers, what you may not understand when they come to your office and report something to you, administrators, what they may not even come home at the dinner table and tell you that they're going through, parents. So I invite you that today is our new day, that as we begin to ask questions, how are you doing? We listen long enough, and when they say fine or good or cool or I'm chilling, whatever answer your kids give you, that they know that when they're not, that you're there too. So maybe the first step is just to say, oh, tell me a little bit more about that. What's good? Oh, tell me more about that. What's cool? Tell me a little bit more about that. What's okay? And for any parent who's out there, you know how it is. But teachers, you have an opportunity to build those relationships because you know that when the period is over, they're heading to their next class. And so every time you get a chance to build a new relationship with a student, you give them more room and trust that they can come to you in the difficult times. As I close, I just want to let you know that March 4th, 2015, a student brought me a letter. And I've shared the story before. I don't know if I've shared it on the podcast, but it was a letter that I'd never forget. I can almost have it word for word memorized. But a student brought me a note that he wanted to harm himself. It was a day that not only will I never forget because we were having a screening that night of the documentary, The Mask You Live In, but it was a letter that when I looked at this young man just sitting here, I'm like, I never would have known. I've only met the kid 2 or 3 times. He's always seemed like he's in a good mood. And this day, he is now not. And the trust that I had been able to build, even though I had barely met him a couple of times, he brought this letter to me with my name on the letter. I tell you, not only is it a letter that I cherish, it is an experience that I'll never forget. And so I don't wish anybody to ever receive one of those letters, but I hope that you receive the letter and not the news of a student who has hurt themselves. Now, these questions I'm going to post in our school community, Advocates for Young Men by EFC. Reach out to us and let us know your thoughts to these questions. What do these statistics that you heard say about our male students? How do you address bullying as a teacher or as an administrator, or how is it handled at your school? And what are the specific routines and systems that are in place to make students feel welcome and like they belong in your classroom or at your school? These are 3 questions I want you to think about, write some notes about them, share them with us, and maybe we can begin a conversation and dialogue about how we can make sure that more students feel that way. That's at skool.com, EFC Young Men's Advocates. You can find us there. The link will be in the show notes. Join our school community. We're having conversations about what young men need, and we're hearing from a lot of parents about trying to find right supports for their young men and teachers and educators. So please, if you are listening and you are writing these answers to these questions, share them with us there in the school community. We look forward to seeing you there. That's skool.com/EFC Young Men's Advocates. You can join us there. The link will be in the show notes, so you don't have to memorize that. But we look forward to seeing you there, and we look forward to you answering your questions there. Thank you, educators. Thank you, teachers. Thank you, men, for doing this work in education. We need you. Our young people need you. And our young men and boys definitely need you. Thanks for being a part of this conversation with educators. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Take care. Be well. Bye now.